From the beginning of the George W. Bush administration in 2001, there were indeed pressures toward war. However, in the first 8 months of that administration, the State Department, the uniformed military, and the intelligence community blocked efforts inspired by the Project for a New American Century and led by Vice President Cheney and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld to launch a war in Iraq as the first stage of a radical transformation of U.S. foreign policy toward global hegemony and military unilateralism. For 8 months, their efforts were thwarted. Then on 9/11, the attacks we suffered produced an immense amount of political capital for any president, including George W. Bush. He could do practically anything he could be persuaded was the right thing to do at that time. And the supremacist cabal, almost to a man and woman linked directly to the Project for the New American Century, had just the fantasy ready for him. The attack signaled, they told George W., a global epochal war on terror, and God, in his infinite wisdom, had made sure that he, George W. Bush, was there to play the role of Winston Churchill. And George W. bought it. This simple, rigid, antinomian view of the world matched his instincts. He bought it, hook, line, and sinker. As the supremacists spun it, the global war on terror divided the world into those with us versus those against us. Now, coupled with the principle of preemption, this division of the world into our camp and the enemy camp logically, automatically rendered any country or group not with us as subject to immediate attack by the United States at will. In this way, although Iraq had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11, the supremacist, mainly neoconservative cabal that took control of U.S. foreign policy and national security policy after 9/11 was able to devise and implement a formula linking the 9/11 attacks to its long-cherished goal, forcible regime change in Iraq, as a model for a series of quick neo-imperialist wars. Wars that would revolutionize American foreign policy and accomplish conservative political objectives at home. Listen to how Bill Kristol, editor of the Weekly Standard and president of the Project for the New American Century, put it. In an article published in Foreign Affairs in 1996, co-authored by Robert Kagan, co-founder of PNAC and a primary theorist of the current surge into Iraq, Kristol and Kagan advocated a muscular use of American hyperpower to destroy the world's monsters and manage empire. This neo-Reaganite foreign policy, inaugurated by the liberation of Iraq, quote, would be good for conservatives, good for America, and good for the world. Deprived of the support of an elevated patriotism, bereft of the ability to appeal to national honor, conservatives will ultimately fail in their effort to govern America. They needed something to replace the Cold War. Clinton, running on issues defined as the center of the agenda that are social and economic, was frighteningly successful despite scandals. In other words, we are in Iraq today because of the latent propensity of the U.S. to go to war, a propensity born of immense military preponderance and ruthlessly but decisively exploited by a supremacist cabal able to portray its long-sought invasion of Iraq as a requirement of a global war on terror. After years of slaughter in Iraq, the neoconservative fantasy of a series of cheap, fast, and politically satisfying wars is dying, if not yet completely dead. Hence the beating of tom-toms in the direction of Iran. But the war on terror lives on, stronger than ever. How did the war on terror take on a life of its own and trap the entire political class and most Americans into public beliefs about the need to fight a global war on terror as our first priority, even when there's no evidence of an enemy present in the United States? So I've argued, this is where the war on terror came from. We could have responded to 9/11 in many ways. The idea of a global war on terror was a manufactured script that would allow that particular group to link its long-sought goal to 9/11 and thereby accomplish it, since the American people and most of the government opposed it. Now the question is, once it got started, in face of its irrationality, how does it continue? How does it sustain itself? Well, let's start by considering Congress. Consider how Congress responded to the War on Terror. And any of you who have a pencil and paper may want to write these numbers down. In the summer of 2003, a list of 160 potential targets for terrorists was drawn up, triggering intense efforts by representatives and senators and their constituents to find funding generating targets in their districts. Their own 160 is not nearly 435. The result? Widening definitions and blurrier categories of potential targets, and mushrooming increases in the number of infrastructure and other assets deemed worthy of protection. The number went up to 1,849 later in 2003. In 2004, it went to 28,364. In 2005, the number was 77,069. And in 2006, it's an estimated 300,000. See, the Department of Homeland Security had billions of dollars every year in state and local funding to disperse. The department had to figure out how it was going to decide which of all of these thousands of proposals from counties and states and cities it should fund. So it devised a list of 15 national planning scenarios to help guide its allocations. To qualify for Homeland Security funding, state and local governments had to describe how they would use allocated funds to meet one of the chosen disaster or terrorist attack scenarios. In other words, if you wanted funding, you have to say that one of the 15 scenarios was what you were preparing for. So what was the process that produced this list of 15? It was in part deeply political, driven by competition among government agencies, states, and localities who knew that funding opportunities would depend on exactly which scenarios were included or excluded. So anthrax, a chemical attack on a sports stadium, and hoof and mouth disease were all included. But attacks on a liquid natural gas tanker or West Nile virus, these were not included. So, question of which lobbies were successful. Now, what's most instructive of all about this process was the unwillingness of the government to define the enemy posing the terrorist threat. Why? Because if a particular enemy was identified, certain scenarios profitable for some funding competitors would be disqualified. I mean, if that's the enemy, they're not going to use hoof and mouth disease, or they're not going to drop chemicals on a, they might do, a nuclear bomb, but they wouldn't do that. So that would immediately disqualify most. So you've got to come up with a definition of the enemy that doesn't disqualify anybody. Otherwise, you're prejudging. So I was very interested to read the fine print to find out, well, when they refer to who's doing this, how do they refer to they say Al-Qaeda or its clones or Muslim extremists or, no. The enemy in these scenarios is referred to as, quote, the universal adversary. In other words, Satan. That is how the war on terror, by figuring the enemy as the devil, as in a sense, any bad thing that you could imagine happening is a national security imperative that anyone can use to struggle for funds. That is how the war on terror derives the country from responding to threats to preparing for vulnerabilities, and that's a completely different thing. A threat comes from somewhere, a vulnerability doesn't. This produces an irrational and doomed strategic posture which treats any bad thing that could happen as a national security imperative.